What a crowd. I think they said this fits about 800 people, and it looks like we're right at about 800. Very exciting. My name is Brett Narloch. I'm the Executive Director of the North Dakota Policy Council, the group hosting tonight's event with Congressman Paul. And you know, I'm looking at everybody, and I was starting to wonder, geez, is everybody here to listen to me talk? Something tells me it has to do with our guest here. But I'm okay with that, because I can't think of anyone better or more qualified to speak about the status of liberty in this country than Congressman Paul. The North Dakota Policy Council we're a non-profit, non-partisan organization dedicated to improving people's lives by advocating for public policy that is based on the ideas of liberty. We work with grassroots activists, state lawmakers, community and business leaders all across the state on issues like tax reform and budget reform and public pensions and all those sorts of things, property rights. We host town hall meetings kind of like this, not quite as big, all over the state. We have policy luncheons and briefings with state legislators and people like that. And what we try to do is just preach to anybody who will listen to us the values of liberty and free markets, property rights, contract rights, the very same things that Congressman Paul talks about. And Congressman Paul is not quite on the stage yet, but I just want him to know how much he has influenced the North Dakota Policy Council. We were in the early stages of our growth, and we just started in about 2007 or so. And I happened to be watching a speech of his on YouTube, and it really stuck with me. And it wasn't. I can't remember who was doing the interview, what network it was on, what the topic was, or anything like that. But he said something that, like I said, has stuck with me since that day. And he said, "Freedom is simple." That phrase stuck with me so much that it became the motto of the North Dakota Policy Council. So he has influenced us more than he'll ever know. Before I bring Dr. Paul onto the stage, I just want to take care of a couple of housekeeping items here. First of all, I'd like to thank all the volunteers who helped make this happen. Everyone standing at the front, making sure everyone gets registered. Everyone who helped behind the scenes, Brianne Fisher, Charles and Vern, they're right down here, for taking care of all the details that I just wasn't able to do in such short notice. And then immediately following this event, we're going to have a little private fundraiser with Dr. Paul in a room right across the hall here. And so when you're leaving, there's going to be a table right outside the door with some forms. And if you're interested in attending that little private reception, please check it out. We're asking that you pledge to donate at least $100 to the North Dakota Policy Council to attend, and you'll get a chance to shake Dr. Paul's hand, chat with him a little bit, and all of that good stuff. Congressman Ron Paul is one of my personal heroes. He enjoys a national reputation as a premier advocate for liberty in politics today. Dr. Paul is the leading spokesman in Washington for limited constitutional government, low taxes, free markets, and a return to sound monetary policy. He is known among both his colleagues in Congress and his constituents for his consistent voting record in the House of Representatives. Dr. Paul never votes for legislation unless the proposed measure is expressly authorized by the Constitution. In the words of former Treasury Secretary William Simon, Dr. Paul is the one exception to the gang of 535 on Capitol Hill. He was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He graduated from Gettysburg College and Duke University School of Medicine before proudly serving as a flight surgeon in the U.S. Air Force during the 1960s. He and his wife, Carol, moved to Texas in 1968, where he began his medical practice. As an OBGYN, Dr. Paul has delivered more than 4 1,000 babies. He and Carol are the proud parents of 5 children and 18 grandchildren. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce Congressman Ron Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Brett, for that introduction. Thank you all for coming out and that very nice reception. Before I get started, though, I would like to introduce my wife, Carol, sitting over here. And Linda is representing our grandchildren. She's one of the 18. But it is a delight. I was up here last year for the Policy Council. It's something I believe in because ideas have consequences, and that is very, very important. There is a revolution going on these days, and it has started. It's an intellectual revolution. My goal is to make sure that it's a nonviolent revolution because it is an ideological revolution, but it's not brand new. It's just a continuation of a revolution that we had a long time ago, and the American people, we have sort of forgotten about it. So what we want is to carry on the revolutionary spirit that made America great because we have allowed it to slack off, and that's what it's all about. The revolutionary spirit to reinvigorate the American people with the ideas of liberty. You know, the principles of liberty, if they're fully, followed, you do have what I'm convinced of is you will end up with the freest society and the most prosperous society, and also the safest. There would be peace and prosperity. Since people, all of us are imperfect, it's not going to be a perfect society, but if you emphasize and understand the principles of liberty, it de-emphasizes the notion that we should depend on government to take care of us from cradle to grave and tell us how to run our lives and run the economy. So that is the reason that America was at one time the greatest and freest and most prosperous nation in the world, and that's what we have to restore. But basically, individual liberty is the issue, and Jefferson certainly recognized where we got our life and our liberty. It comes from our Creator. It comes to us in a natural way. It isn't given to us by the government. The government, about all they can do is take it away from us, and yet the government, the limited government that we want to have, should be designed to protect our liberty and nothing else. That should be the role of government. Now, to understand liberty, I guess the most other important issue to understand is property. Because if you have a right to your life, if you have a right to your liberty, you ought to have a right to keep the fruits of your labor. Of course, that means the government can't take away the fruits of our labor through an onerous tax system, and they can't take away our wealth by destruction of our currency, which means we wouldn't have an income tax, but we wouldn't have a Federal Reserve System either. But property is the important issue. Even if you look at the Bill of Rights, you can probably defend all the whole Bill of Rights if you understand property. So even if it's personal liberty, it's your property. Your body is your property. The government shouldn't control what you do. At the same time, if you look at if it's religious liberty, all you have to do is say, protect the building, protect the church. They can't come into our homes. They can't come into our churches or synagogues or mosques. So the property is very, very important. Of course, property is what we work for, and the government shouldn't assume ownership. And yet today, if you look at the income tax, the government assumes they own all of it, and they allow us to keep a certain percentage. So we've conceded way too much. But what about when we try to pass a property on to the next generation? The government comes along, even after we pay taxes to build a business or build a farm or whatever, then the government comes along and says, all right, we're going to take our share unless you pass on the next. That challenges the whole principle of property ownership. And it's the property ownership which it dictates, the issue of contract rights. Your property, if you understand personal liberty, you come together socially with a mutual agreement by two parties. In business and economics, that's the way it should be. It should be voluntarism with an emphasis on property rights. The government should protect our right of contract and protect our property. But today they're always interfering with our property rights. They believe they own the property. They regulate our property. To use our property, so often we have to get umpteen permits to use it. So if we understand individual liberty, where it comes from, where production comes from, and the limited role for government and the issue of private property, and apply this not only to us in a personal, social way, in an economic way, but also represent and also recognize internationally. It isn't our business, it isn't our property, it isn't our right to go around the world and telling other people how they have to live either. In the last 100 years, we have weakened our defense of property and contracts and sound money and a sensible foreign policy. And we've gotten ourselves into a mess, but right now the American people are waking up. Because of groups like the Policy Council, there are many of these groups around now teaching and recognizing and getting people to understand why it's in all of our best interest to have more freedom and less government. This will solve our problems if we recognize that one little fact. We cannot depend on the government to get us out of this mess. It's the government overspending, over-regulation, over-taxation, printing too much money. All these things have gotten us into trouble, so we certainly can't solve our problem. So it is an issue dealing with ideas. The Policy Council has the right ideas, or I wouldn't be so encouraging for the Council, because right now, the ideas are sweeping, more so than ever. There's always been some around. Even all my lifetime, I've always known small little groups here and here and here. But now they're growing by leaps and bounds, and people who had been waiting for this opportunity are coming out of the woodworks that have thought about this and have felt like they have been disenfranchised. But also, what excites me is there's a whole new young generation that is now endorsing the ideas, and there's reason to be optimistic about it. And this is the reason why I think in the last 5 years there's been a dramatic change. Most people now that the system of Keynesian economics, the funny money system, the wars that have gone on, it's all failing, and our middle class is shrinking, property rights are gone, civil liberties are under attack. But now, right now, our government is way behind the people, because the people are recognizing this and they are complaining about it, and they're coming out, and I sense that this country is changing, and it's changing for the better. And I want to thank you very much for being here this evening.
Very good. And like I mentioned, we're very honored that you came not only once to the Policy Council now, but twice. And we're very appreciative of that. But what I want to do is kind of go back a ways in your life and get to the root of when you started understanding liberty, what it meant, and why you thought it was so important to go across the country and teach us about it. What got you interested in liberty?
You know, I've gotten this question asked a lot, and of course I've thought about it a lot. And the way I see it, I think, from my viewpoint, and I think it's true with a lot of people, I think most of us are born with the instinct of wanting to be free and left alone and want to be our own person. And generally what happens, though, is those instincts are sort of knocked down because the establishment, whether it's our educational system or whether it's the government, whether it's the movies, the media, or whatever, they teach you that your instincts, that you should be an individual and be responsible for yourself. We're taught that we should be dependent on government for too much, and that your instincts thinks they're wrong. But I think you see it in little children. They're born, they're very independent-minded. I think most of us, when we were teenagers, we were very independent-minded. But then we have to conform. And a certain amount of that, if we conform with the rejection of the use of violence and force and intimidation, that's fine. But to be creative, you don't have to do this. So I think it's a very natural thing. But I believe that during college and other years, I was sort of learning the wrong things, and I was getting rid of natural instincts. But gradually, it was just a determination. And I think people who come to a meeting like this, they're looking for the truth. They're looking for the truth of what makes the world tick, how the economy runs, and what the government should be all about. So I think there's always a certain group that are always looking for the truth to find out, how it operates. And I started looking for that, not so much in college. A lot of people think maybe I was a real political activist in college, but I sort of kid and said the only time I was concerned about a political activity going on in college was in 1956 when the Suez Canal crisis came up, when the British and the French wanted to have a war over it. And I remember, oh my goodness, because I remember World War II, there's going to be another war and they're going to draft me. And so I was perking my ears up about what was going on. Unfortunately, the President Eisenhower wasn't much for that. He says, I'm not going over there. So the whole war ended rather quickly when we weren't getting involved. But other than that, I really came around in the 1960s. I came across studying Austrian free market economics, and the portion of Austrian free market economics, the two things. One is the difference, the dramatic difference between free market economics and that of Keynesian economics, and the whole idea of what Mises talks about, human action. There's a human element in economics. It's what individuals do, and you can't have a computer and you can't take these mathematical equations and project what we will do as individuals. And that's the whole theme of what Mises taught. But the one part of economics that I became even more fascinated with was the monetary policy. And then I tied that in with my concern about why do we have recessions and why do we have depressions, why do we have inflations, and how do they finance wars and how do they finance a welfare state, because they don't do it through taxation completely, and they do it through borrowing, but then eventually you find out that they do it through destruction of money, which leads to the crisis like we're having today. So it was that, and then in the 60s, the free market economists predicted that the system that we had, which was called the Bretton Woods system, where it was a pseudo-gold standard. It wasn't a gold standard. We weren't even allowed to own gold. But there was a link of our dollar to gold at $35 an ounce. But we were still printing money like crazy. And so the free market people said, it won't last. It's going to break down. You cannot maintain it at $35 an ounce because the foreigners could still turn in $35 and get an ounce of gold. We had over 700 ounces of gold, and after they drained 500 million ounces of gold because we had printed too many dollars, then that thing collapsed. The whole system collapsed, and that was in 1971. And it was then that I started speaking out. And in 1974, I ran for Congress sort of on a lark and thinking, well, this gives me a chance to speak out. And my wife Carol said to me, well, what do you want to run for Congress for? And I said, well, just to speak out because of these issues. And I said, this is something I think is important, and nobody else is doing it. And there were only 3 Democrats in Texas at the time, and what did I say? 3 Democrats. No, there were only 3 Republicans. It was all Democrats. So there was a long-term Democrat that was in the district, so I knew I couldn't win. So I said, well, I'm just doing this on a lark to talk about economics. She said, this could be dangerous. I said, how can it be dangerous? She said, you might end up winning. But I assured her that couldn't be possible because what I was doing was challenging, the entire status quo. But I didn't win that race, but won afterwards. But it was the money issue connected to free markets, but really back to that important issue, individual liberty and property rights, and then it all comes together, whether it's personal liberty, economic liberty, or foreign policy. It all comes together when you understand what freedom is all about.
Sure, and one of my favorite quotes from Thomas Jefferson is this: I would rather be exposed to the inconveniences of attending too much liberty than those attending too small a degree of it. And I like it because, and you mentioned this earlier, that freedom isn't perfect because humans aren't perfect. And could you tell me about how society would deal with some of the inconveniences of too much liberty?
Yeah, and I talk about that a little bit, and I usually paraphrase it in a way of saying that, you know, if I could have a totally free society and have to be poorer because of it, I would want my freedom. There's no doubt in my money. I'd rather have my freedom. But the whole thing is we don't have to make that choice. If we understand this, the freer we are, the more prosperity. And that's what we proved. We had the freest society, and we had the most prosperous society ever. And so there isn't that choice. But for some reason, up until this time, since we are gaining momentum, we have not had moral high ground, because the moral high ground was on those people that we who believed in the marketplace, we were told that we didn't care about people. Oh, you want people to be out in the streets, no medical care, they can't eat and all this. But now we've seen what has happened with the 20th century wars and communism and failure of socialism. So there's no doubt in our minds that there's the humanitarian should always opt for freedom, because we're going to take care of more people. But that doesn't answer the question, so how do you? We know we're not going to have a perfect society. Of course, let's say there's 2 or 3% that's always going to have needs. So if we invent the entitlement system and the inflation system, that 2 or 3% goes to 20 or 30 or 40%. And that's what we're in the midst of dealing with. But how do we take care of that? Well, we have a pretty good example of that. When I first got out of medical school, we didn't have Medicare or Medicaid. We had essentially no government medicine. I worked in a charity hospital, and I was making $3 an hour, and nobody was put out in the streets. So there were, at the time, churches ran hospital. Even today, there's a hospital in my congressional district. It's called a Shriners Burn Hospital, and it's mainly for children. And if a child has a burn, they come there. They don't have to pay if they don't have any money, so they're taken care of. So we've lost our confidence and understanding, and we have listened to the demagogues that say that, you know, we want more power because people won't take care of themselves. But it is a intellectual explanation, convincing people that the market is better and to show how it works. But to pretend that it's going to be perfect is not so. It's just that the problems will be less. First thing, just assume that in a free society, the responsibility is on every single individual. If every single individual would take care of him or herself, there wouldn't be a whole lot of problems. The few other people, of course, there should be family around to help. And then if there's not a family, where do you go? Maybe they go to their church. Maybe they go to the community. And actually, the Constitution doesn't prohibit, you know, local governments from helping. Our system has no authority for the federal government to get involved in these social programs. But even if you went to the extent of saying, well, we don't even need local government to do it, it would still work out. It would still solve the problem, because there would be so much more wealth. You would have more Bill Gates, as it were, and Steve Jobs of the world, because there would be, they don't even know what to do with their money. They make so much money because there is a remnant part of the free market system. There would be so many more people, how many hospitals they could build. Just think of the $4 trillion of debt that we have run up in the last 10 years on these wars that have been so senseless. $4 trillion pumped into our economy. Maybe we would be worrying a lot less about the delivery of medical care. Today we have more and more government and less medicine. More and more money into education, less and less quality of education. So the evidence is very clear that you know, free people are very capable of taking care of themselves.
You know, Dr. Paul, we at the North Dakota Policy Council, we preach, like I said, to anybody who will listen, about the value of free markets and voluntary exchange and contracts and property rights and those things. But I think, at least from my experience, and it's certainly not as vast as yours, but a lot of people don't quite understand what free markets mean. They'll say, when we had a free market in 2002, everything was bad. So how would you define free markets, and can you have freedom without free markets?
No, if you have freedom, you have to have free markets, and you have to have property right, and it has to be private property rights. But we got off on a tangent on that in the 1930s, because the intellectuals were going in the wrong directions. Ideas have consequences. Bad ideas have bad consequences. So in the 1930s, they said, aha, it was capitalism, free markets, and the gold standard that caused the Depression. And it was refuted by a few. But the community of the intellectuals in the universities, they were rejecting that, and they wanted to go toward this Keynesian socialism, welfareism. But the Federal Reserve caused the problem. This is where we're having an advantage today. Because up until now, this is the first time in the history of the Federal Reserve. It's 100 years old. Next year, there'll be 100 years. I thought for the anniversary, we probably ought to repeal the Federal Reserve Act. But anyway, the Federal Reserve and free market capitalism was blamed for it, and we've been going in the wrong direction until finally we've destroyed our money, we've destroyed the markets, we've destroyed private property right, we're destroying education, we're destroying medical care, and I mean, the evidence is there. So yes, a lot of people still say that it was all this free market capitalism under George Bush that was caused this crisis. No, that isn't the case. And one problem we always have, and we still have it now, is some people want to make this, a partisan thing. Oh, all our problems today is coming because of our current president. And our president hasn't done a thing to help, there is no doubt. And he's done a lot of things to make it worse. But I tell you what, you have to go all the way back to 1913, the change in attitude of foreign policy, monetary policy, and also tax policy and the welfare state. And we've been working on this. It's been a bipartisan deal. This is why people say, well, how can I get this stuff done if I'm elected to be president? How are you going to compromise and bring these people together? I says, I'm sick and tired of the compromises. That's what they've been doing for all these years. But the wonderful thing about freedom is it works in a different way. It isn't compromising and try and sell out and say, oh, you want to spend money for this reason, and conservatives want to spend it for this reason, we'll get together and we'll raise the spending and raise the debt. But freedom brings people together in coalitions, and all of a sudden it isn't a Republican versus Democrat thing. So often we get people, who knows, there could be a few in here they might not want to say, but guess what, we get a lot of independents and even Democrats to come and hear this message. So this is because if you talk about personal liberty, at least on the surface, Democrats and liberals at least pretend to defend personal liberties, and the true ones get very frustrated because they don't do it. And conservatives are supposed to defend the marketplace, and sometimes they do it partially. But you try to bring conservatives together who agree with free markets, you try to bring liberals who believe in civil liberties, and then what we need now, right now, as much as anything, is a coalition of just good Americans that say we have no right to invade these countries, we have no right to have preemptive war, which means starting wars, we have no right to assassinate American citizens and arrest American citizens with the U.S. Army, and we can bring people together. That, to me, is the answer, rather than saying, well, blame one party versus the other. That wears me out, because that's all they do is blame each other.
Sticking to economics here a little bit, but bringing that into foreign policy, I don't think a lot of people understand that there's an economic argument to be against all of these wars. And you kind of touched on that earlier. I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yes, in the debates, they frequently say, well, this debate tonight is going to be on foreign policy, and the next one will be on economic policy. And I really challenge that, because you spend money. you spend money overseas, and your foreign policy has to do with what you believe in trade. You believe in trade and diplomacy and friendship, or like the founders advised, or do you believe in tariffs and sanctions and restrictions, or these wars that are going on? It costs a lot of money. Just think the Soviet system, the Soviet Empire collapsed for economic reasons. I mean, they had 30,000 nuclear weapons. When I was drafted in 1962, they had these huge number of weapons. They were putting them in Cuba. It was really a dangerous period of time. But we didn't have to fight them. We didn't have to have a nuclear war with them. But they did something really, really, let's see, what's the best word to use? Not so smart, really pretty stupid. They went and invaded Afghanistan and occupied Afghanistan. And this is what always brings down great nations, is that they overextend their empire. They think that they're the greatest and the best, and they can bully people, and it doesn't work. My idea about spreading American goodness is do a good job here. Defend the marketplace. Defend sound money. Defend civil liberties. Don't invade other countries. Be friends with people. Trade with people. And set an example. Then guess what? The other part of the world may say, hey, that sounds like a great place. Why don't we try to emulate them and not use force?
You've talked a couple times tonight about sound currency and the Federal Reserve and how that ties into a free market economy. And you often talk about ending the Fed, but you talk about auditing the Fed. That's kind of the first step. Could you explain to people, maybe what you'd expect to find if there was a true audit of the Federal Reserve, or what is it that why is it so important that we actually do audit the Fed?
Well, we should, because Congress is irresponsible first for creating it and then never looking at what they're doing. For instance, during the bailouts in 07 and 08, they churned $15 trillion. That's many folds greater than what the Congress does. Their budget is much bigger, but they do it in secrecy. But the Congress has the responsibility of oversight. It shouldn't have been created, but if you're going to create it, you're supposed to look after it. And then a large portion of it is privately owned and privately run. Although the 7 main members are approved by the Senate, it's really private, but I like to think of that as being totally secret. So allowing them to do this, to give money to foreign countries and foreign banks and not to have this information out, although we didn't get the audit, we have forced them through some court cases to reveal, so we know more now than ever before. But I think even though I was so negative and concerned about what they've done, I've been really surprised at how much they really do. I mean, I would never dream that they would have been, involved with $15 trillion. That just boggles the mind. And they're guaranteeing that they're going to continue to do that because Europe still is in crisis, which means that they believe the dollar is going to bail out the world forever. If that were true, not one single American would have to ever work again, because all we'd have to do is print money. But we know we're up against the wall. The debt is too big, and we're the biggest debtor nation in the history of the world. So that's not going to happen, and that is the reason why we have to know more about, not only know more about the Federal Reserve, but know more about monetary policy. Why lower interest rates and creating a credit lowers the interest rates lower than the market, causing business people and savers to do things that they wouldn't have done otherwise. And this is how housing bubbles come about. Interest rates are low, it looks like there's a lot of savings, but there aren't any savings. The capital, the pseudo capital, is coming out of a computer at the Fed. So it's the business cycle that they cause. And then they say, well, we're not having much inflation, and what they're saying is that prices aren't going up real fast. But you have to think about inflation as the increase in the money supply, and one of the bad effects will be that some prices will go up, but not uniformly. Wages never go up like the prices go up. Prices go up faster for the people on retired incomes, and the beneficiaries are the people who get the capital first. The big business people, the banks, military-industrial complex, the government, they get to use that money first. So it's very unfair. And higher prices is just one of the consequences. So you need to look at the moral issue. It is counterfeit, so that's immoral and should be illegal. If you did it, it's illegal. It should be illegal for the Federal Reserve to do it. It's unconstitutional. It's bad economic policy. And one of the worst things is it's deceitful in that the bills are paid in a way that nobody knows who the victims are. And that's the inflationary tax. And that has allowed our government to grow excessively, which means your personal liberties are undermined because the government is growing excessively. So whether we get the full audit or whether we can systematically, compete or get rid of the Federal Reserve is sort of a moot point in a way, because this system isn't sustainable. They're already talking about the replacement currency. I talk about it too. But I believe that we are a sovereign country. It should be done constitutionally. It should be done by us. It shouldn't be done by the United Nations. That's what they're trying to do.
And digging down a little bit deeper into this issue, I've heard you say several times that basically what the Federal Reserve is doing by setting interest rates is that they're price fixing, and we wouldn't want people to fix the price of gas or anything else, so why would we want them to fix interest rates?
That is true. Most economists now would deny that they're for wage and price controls. The last time they were official, they did it during World War II, they do it during the war periods, they did it through the Korean War, and then Nixon did it when they had that crisis when the Bretton Woods broke down, because there was a lot of inflation, price inflation in the early 1970s. But there still is. There's a lot of price fixing in wages, in labor, because you have government always having wage laws that are artificially fixing wage rates. But medical care costs are fixed. They say we're going to give free medical care. Prices go up, we'll fix the prices, and they have to ration it. One thing leads to another. So we have a lot of it, but it's not so universal. But it does interfere with the market. But the fixing of the interest rate, when you think money, the monetary unit, the dollar, is 1/2 of every single transaction. So your wages, your work, what you buy and sell, the value of your house, everything is measured in terms of dollars. So every transaction, 50% of it, is artificially fixed by the Federal Reserve. The value of the currency, and then the price of the interest rates is the closest thing you can come to saying the price of money. So if it's artificially low, it's going to cause gross distortions that creates the bubble. So the bubbles are very easy to identify. And yet here we have a system of monetary policy where those who are in charge are in total denial, because you take a guy like Bernanke, if he had to admit the truth of what's happening, he would have to say his 40 years in academia was all wrong, and was all for naught, and everything he ever read or said or wrote was completely wrong. There's no way he's going to do this. So in 2006, he was taking over the Federal Reserve, and he said at the time, some of these minutes come out very late. At that time, he revealed, his reassurance was, we were looking at the housing industry. It's in very good shape. It looks like it's sustainable. No problems there. So we make him chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. And he had been in there with Greenspan, and none of them identified the NASDAQ bubble. And the NASDAQ is 40% of what it was in the year 2000. So we've been in the doldrums. The housing market is in the doldrums. What we need is a lot more freedom, and we need sound money.
All right. I was debating the whole debt debate with a friend of mine not too long ago, and he said, all we have to do is if we just had those rich people pay their fair share, then our fiscal house would be in order. And I said, if we took all of Warren Buffett's money, that would hardly put a dent into anything. And so I'm wondering, to get our fiscal house in order, is there a combination of taxes and cutting spending that we should do, or should we stick to the spending side? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we don't want to raise taxes. We want a lot lower taxes. But we need to cut the spending. And my proposal is that just as a modest start, we should cut $1 trillion out of the budget, right in 1 year. If we were serious, that's what we do. But nobody is serious about it. What they're talking about are cuts. You know, last summer the Congress was supposed to cut some money out of the budget. Congress it couldn't happen, so they set up this super committee, and they didn't do anything. So the automatic cuts come in of $1.2 trillion over a 10-year period. But what they're cutting is, if you look at the baseline, because there's always need for more and more money, government's on an autopilot. It's growing like this. So it's supposed to grow about $9 or $10 trillion over the next 10 years. So they're going to cut $1.2 trillion over a 10-year period of the proposed increases. It's no cuts at all. It's just a slight little dent in the proposed increases. And they're talking about cutting $100 billion. That used to be a lot of money. They cut $100 billion per year. Our national debt is going up $100 billion every single month. So this is why cuts have to occur. Individuals cannot have their own economic growth if they're in over their head, they've spent too much money, one member of the family lost their job, the income is down, so they either have to do a couple things. They declare bankruptcy. Some people feel more obligated and want to pay off their debt. What do? They cut back and they go get a second job and they work very hard and they start paying down. But their standard of living goes down. They might have to sell a vehicle or their second home, and they can't have economic growth until they liquidate the debt, because the debt is a great burden. And this is the way a country is, but we're in denial there because there is no denial, there is no liquidation of debt. This bubble collapsed because of the derivatives markets. The banks were involved. All this mortgage derivatives in the banks were way overextended, but they were too big to fail, so they had to be bailed out by the Federal Reserve, trillions of dollars. But the debt wasn't liquidated, but it was taken away from the people who were ripping us off, and that debt was given to the middle class. And that's why the doldrums still exist in the middle class, and the economy isn't really growing. So it is the liquidation of debt, cutting the spending, and then you'll have economic growth. We had a bad depression in 1921, 1921. It was a little over a year. And it was a consequence of the inflation that came quickly after the Fed was created to fight the unnecessary World War I. But the inflation of the money supply caused a boom, and then there was a recession. And no, it was a depression. They called it a depression. I think GDP went down like 13 or 14% in 1 year. But nobody thought the government was supposed to do anything. They just kept hands off. So the people who were overextended, the debt was liquidated. It was over in a year. And we hardly even study it in history. But the Depression came, and the Keynesians were too much in charge. They say, we have to do something. We can't allow these people to suffer and go bankrupt and all these things. So the Depression lasted from 1929 to 1946. That's how long it took to get out of the Depression. Japan right now has been in the doldrums for 20 years because they will not liquidate debt. And we're doing the same thing again. I think we really started this problem in the year 2000. No real new jobs in these past 2 years. 30 million new people, but not very many new jobs at all. And so we haven't allowed the process to work. We haven't allowed. See, government makes mistakes. The market always wants to correct it. The market wants to get rid of the mistakes. But if you keep propping up the mistakes, you will inevitably lead to a debt which is unsustainable, like Greece finally got to, and we're on our way there. And if they assume, like they are, if they continue to assume that everybody can get bailed out by the dollar, because the dollar is special. They're still trusting the dollar. It's still a reserve currency of the world. But I'll tell you what, even this very weekend, there's supposed to be some major decisions. Like every week there seems to be another major decision over Greece on what they do and how the debt's going to be handled, because they won't liquidate the debt. They're just looking around for victims. And right now it looks like we're going to be the victim, because it looks like Bernanke's going to bail out. But if they continue to do this, they're going to destroy the dollar. And then the dollar will be rejected. It will be big news. Nobody will be ignoring that. Every single American will have to suffer some consequences on that. That, of course, is what we should work very hard to try to prevent.
Very good. And the last two questions have a little bit more to do with what's happening here in North Dakota. And the first one is energy. Williston, North Dakota, right here is the sort of the ground zero or the epicenter of a major oil boom here, an economic boom in the upper Midwest. And one of the things I think all of us here in North Dakota keep doing is we look over our shoulders at what the EPA is going to do, or some of these other regulatory bodies, to stop it. And so I was hoping you would be able to talk a little bit about how the environment can be taken care of in a free market, and if the federal government should be involved at all in those types of issues.
I think you're right. There are people there that, finally we have an example for special conditions, and there's a boom here. Instead of saying, how did it happen? And let's try to spread this message. They want to stop it. I mean, this is the way they think. They go, oh yes, we need power, we need charge. The people in North Dakota, they don't know what they're doing. They won't take care of the environment, and they'll go on, and only the people in Washington will know what the answer is. On a side note, I was sitting beside a member of Congress, and we were voting on something having to do with regulations for protecting the individual, some economic issue. And I said, why are you doing this? Why don't you just let people take care of themselves? And why do you want to, have these programs? He says, well, they're too stupid. And this is their attitude. They really believe that we don't have our own self-interest, or our community interest, or our state interest. And it's out of control. This is one reason why the founders feared this and warned us, didn't want the power to be in Washington. Of course, there was a lot of people who were concerned that there'd be loopholes in the Constitution, and those who were worried finally said, now we have seen the Republic is gone. And that's why, as well as you're doing, you cannot be complacent, because the radical environmentalists will come in. How does the free market handle this? Well, the free market actually should be very, very strict in protection of the environment, as long as you do it on property rights. Nobody has the right to pollute their neighbor's property. You don't have a right to pollute somebody's water. You don't have a right to pollute somebody's air. You don't have a right to do any harm to your neighbor's property. And the history is pretty good. The more socialistic and communist the nation has been, the worse the environment has been. And I mean, just look at the commons, the properties, in the West. I don't know what your percentage is, but I'm sure you have still a lot of federal land in this state. Probably not as much as Nevada. But when everybody owns it, nobody owns it, and nobody takes care of it. And then you say, well, how are we going to develop it? Well, no, we don't want to develop it. Then you argue back and forth because nobody really owns it. Texas is a pretty good example on how natural resources were taken care of. Because when Texas got their independence from Mexico, it was very independent, and there was no government-owned land. We went into the Union, but there was no government-owned land, and there was natural resources there. It was all done by property rights, and that was in the day when it was more difficult to define oil fields and all, but they were able to work that out, and I'm sure some of those laws apply across the country. But this idea, see, in economics, I want to treat property just like the liberals like to say that there should be no prior restraint in their product. Their product is the media, the news, the newspaper. There's no prior restraint, but there are limits. They're not supposed to slander and libel people, so there's a limit to it. But what if the media had to go and report to the government to get permission to produce their product? Well, people who own land shouldn't have to get permission and have these arbitrary rules written. Government writes, Congress writes a general law, then the executive branch, the agencies themselves write all these regulations, and they magnify all these laws. They shouldn't even have the right to write those regulations. All the regulations should be, written. The laws written by the Congress. But under the Constitution, that should have all been local. It all should be local. I mean, if there's... It was mentioned in the introduction, I believe, that Carol and I were raised in Pittsburgh, and I remember what it was like during World War II, and we had a lot of steel mills, and there was very little pollution control. The skies were black till noon. There was black soot around, and the rivers were polluted. The rivers, the sewers, the government sewers were dumped in the rivers, and there was no controls whatsoever. But it got so bad that Pittsburgh decided to clean it up. And they had local rules and regulations because there was property destruction. And they cleaned up the city before the EPA came along. But it is not the easiest thing to defend, but I really believe that private ownership and the respect for property rights is a much better way to protect the environment than the bureaucrats who have an agenda, and sometimes it's anti-development, and it's anti-capitalism, and it's anti-progress. But freedom will come up with the answers, but it has to be done, carefully, and it won't have easy answer because some of these conditions dealing with energy right now about fracking, these other things can be more complex. But the principle is very clear. That you can't pollute a neighbor's property, and the rules should be very, very local, and you should have a right of recourse if somebody does harm to you by destroying your environment.
I'm glad you brought up property rights. Right in June, voters in North Dakota are going to vote on it's a constitutional measure, Measure 2, to abolish property taxes. And putting aside the specifics of the measure, because it's a pretty lengthy measure, I was hoping you'd be able to talk a little bit in general about what it means when government taxes property, and you talked a little bit about how it's regulated, but if you could talk a little bit more about do you own your land if it's taxed, and those kind of things.
No, I don't think we own our land much. We just pay rent. We have to listen to all the regulators and get all these permits. A lot of times, when I take the position, I want to repeal the 16th and get rid of the income tax. The question always comes up, well, what are you going to replace it with? And I said, nothing. And that would work. It would work if we cut the spending. If we don't have a welfare warfare state, we don't have to have that. So the question then, of course, would come back, if you cut property taxes, what are you going to replace it with? Is it safe to say nothing here as well? But no, it emphasizes the fact that who owns the property? The government owns it because you get your property confiscated if you don't pay your taxes. But the very limited government, there would be some need for some of these funds, but user fees aren't a bad way to do it. We have, but the trouble is now there are a lot of user fees. Our highway funds are user fees, but how do you they take your highway funds and they spend it on wars overseas. They don't have any money. Then they have to appropriate the money, and then you have to go and try to get some of your money back, and then you say, oh, you're trying to earmark something. No, I'm just trying to get my money back to the state of North Dakota because they took the money. But local people, if we didn't have the federal government to deal with, user fees wouldn't be the worst way to do some of these things. But it depends on how big you want the government, whether it's the federal government or the state government. If you want the state government to be doing a lot of things at the state level, if you want a big welfare system, if you want to believe that the state instead of the local communities. When I was in school, it was on the only people my parents had to deal with would be the principal and the school board. That was it. But now today, it's a state, it's a federal government, and unfortunately, some people think that we should have to deal environmental issues even with the United Nations. So that's way too much. So no, I would think that the least amount of taxes should go along with the least amount of government.
Very good. Congressman Paul, this will be the last question of the evening, and it's just kind of a broad one. In your opinion, what is the future of freedom?
Well, right now, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic. A little bit more in the long run, because right now all the good news is out here when I come and see crowds like this, and our crowds have been very, very big here in these last couple of days in Idaho and Washington, and here is just fantastic. But there's a disconnect. The good news is out here. The bad news is they haven't heard from us yet back in Washington. I'm trying to get their attention. But I've been working in this area for a long, long time, and there was always such a small number of people. There was one group back in the 50s that I came across that was very helpful in getting me information. That was called the Foundation for Economic Education. Some of you may remember the name Leonard Reed, who had that. He held things together for a long time. It was a small little think tank. And then others, but now there are hundreds, like your organization. They're all over the place. So that's why we're making progress. So ideas do have consequences, and there are more people now, promoting the right ideas. And we have people who have been, waiting for this and are sitting on the sidelines, and they're coming out and they're becoming more active. But your generation, the young people right now, they're enthusiastic about studying monetary policy, and they don't like this idea of debt. They tell me, even these are teenagers, 15, 16, 17, are studying and reading about the Federal Reserve. I said, this is really encouraging. This is a sign that there's truly a revolution going on. Now, how it's going to transpire, because next week we could have a major crisis, and some of the attacks on our civil liberties are really severe about what they're doing and setting up, arresting American citizens by the military and held without a trial, these kind of things. Then that's it. They did. They repealed posse comitatus and this whole thing. So we have that great danger, and then there's a crisis coming. But the positive side is more and more people are aware of this. So I think that we can win out on this on two important things. Property rights, I think, is the main thing. But the other one that would be a very important one, everything depends on property, whether it's the First Amendment, but even the Second Amendment depends on property. But the understanding of the Second Amendment and the understanding of the debate over the Second Amendment, that along with property rights, I say that we have a pretty good chance of winning this fight.
Very good. Congressman Ron Paul. Thank you very much for coming tonight. And let's give Congressman Ron Paul a big round of applause.